Before an improvised tribunal and under the gaze of cameras, Nicolae Ceaușescu and his wife faced their last day. The dictator who had governed with absolute power for more than 2 decades heard the final sentence in a matter of minutes. Christmas of 1989 became the scene of collapse. The entire country saw how the regime crumbled and how the leader who seemed untouchable fell suddenly, exposed before millions of spectators. How was such an immediate execution decided? Why show death live? Was it justice, warning, or revenge? The Marble Kingdom, power converted into monument. In Bucharest, the capital of Romania, a monumental construction was erected that dominated the horizon and became the visible emblem of a personalist regime. The People's Palace, conceived in white marble and with a colossal mass, became one of the largest administrative buildings on the planet. Its scale did not respond to an institutional necessity, but to the will of a leader who, for more than 2 decades, molded the country as if it were his own domain. Nicolae Ceaușescu acceded to leadership in the second half of the decade of the 60s, after the death of Gheorghiu Dej, whom he had known in his years of communist militancy, and with whom he had shared stays in prison during the party's period of illegality. His rise was seen by veteran members of the Central Committee as a transitional choice. They considered him a manageable figure, but in few years he would demonstrate the opposite, concentrating power and building a system that revolved around his person. The first steps of his government were marked by a turn in foreign policy that granted him international notoriety. In 1968, during the invasion of Czechoslovakia by Warsaw Pact troops, Ceaușescu publicly distanced himself from Moscow. From the balcony of the Central Committee in Bucharest, he denounced the intervention, an unusual gesture in the socialist bloc that generated sympathy in the population and gave him prestige in the West. Romania maintained diplomatic relations with Israel after the Six-Day War, and at the beginning of the 70s, Ceaușescu was received at the White House by President Nixon, which made him the first communist leader to officially visit the United States in the middle of the Cold War. Decades later, when the Soviet Union boycotted the Los Angeles Olympics, the Romanian delegation attended anyway, reinforcing the image of independence from Moscow. That autonomous profile coincided with an experience that transformed his conception of power. In visits to China and, above all, to North Korea, he knew firsthand the system of personality cult established by Kim Il-sung. There he observed massive ceremonies, collective choreographies, and a propaganda apparatus that presented the leader as incarnation of the state. Upon returning to Bucharest, he began to replicate that model. He proclaimed himself conducator, accumulated grandiloquent titles, and ordered the massive reproduction of his image on bills, portraits, and school manuals. Elena Ceaușescu, his wife, was integrated into this scheme with the same prominence. She received apocryphal academic distinctions and appeared as national reference in publications and official acts. To sustain this framework, the repressive network was expanded. The Securitate, the Romanian secret police, became one of the most extensive in Eastern Europe. Its surveillance system included control of correspondence, listening to telephone calls, and installation of recording devices in public and private spaces. A significant proportion of the population collaborated as informants, which generated a generalized climate of distrust. In that context, censorship acquired a total character. From the Free Press House, all media production was centralized, ensuring that party and leader messages reached the national audience without modifications. The country's capital was transformed into a material reflection of that power. After the earthquake of 1977, instead of reconstructing damaged neighborhoods, Ceaușescu promoted a large-scale urban redesign. He ordered the demolition of a fifth of Bucharest's historic center, including religious buildings and aristocratic residences, to make way for a monumental avenue of several kilometers in length and great width. That artery was to lead to the new political center of the regime. The nucleus of this project was the People's Palace, whose construction began in 1984. Conceived as seat of legislative and administrative power, in addition to presidential residence, its construction required enormous quantities of marble, crystal, bronze, and steel. Tens of thousands of workers and hundreds of architects participated in continuous shifts. The work advanced even in the midst of food and energy shortages that affected the population, symbolizing the absolute priority that the regime granted to monumentality over basic needs. Meanwhile, at the Primăverie residence, the presidential family lived surrounded by luxuries that contrasted with the austerity imposed on the rest of society. The mansion had dozens of rooms, handmade furniture, crystal lamps, and original works of art. Its gardens housed exotic birds brought from abroad, and the interior had a private cinema, wine cellar with imported wines, and recreational spaces that included an indoor tropical garden. An entire floor was dedicated to personal well-being, with covered pool decorated with mosaics, sauna, electrotherapy facilities, and specialized personnel available daily. Official acts reinforced the ceremonial character of the regime. Party congresses, scientific exhibitions in honor of Elena, parades and mass concentrations were transmitted entirely by state television and archived as part of official memory. These stagings sought to consolidate the symbolic centrality of the governing couple, integrating politics, spectacle and propaganda in the same visual discourse. On the international level, Romania's image was ambivalent. In the West, Ceaușescu continued to be perceived as a useful interlocutor for his relative autonomy from Moscow. Inside, however, a single-party system was consolidated, hermetic to any dissidents. Unlike other bloc countries where limited margins of social negotiation existed, in Romania all visible opposition was suppressed. The combination of extreme centralization, generalized surveillance, and personality cult defined the political life of the 80s, in which the leader's figure and the state structure merged into a single reference. The set of measures, from architectural monumentality to propagandistic omnipresence, projected an appearance of stability and permanence. Organized repression, systematic censorship, and ostentation of power seemed to form a solid and immutable system. However, parallel to that image of strength, social and economic tensions began to accumulate that would open the path toward an unexpected outcome. In the last years of the decade of the 70s, while Nicolae Ceaușescu exhibited the People's Palace to foreign delegations and multiplied his presence in official portraits, the Romanian economy entered a process of accelerated deterioration. Forced industrialization, financed with Western credits, had created an oversized and uncompetitive productive apparatus. In barely a decade, external debt multiplied several times, placing the country in a position of dependence before international creditors. The enormous steel, machinery and petrochemical plants built in that period produced goods that lacked market, too basic to be exported to the West and redundant within the socialist bloc. The world energy crisis of 1979 aggravated the structural fragility of the economy. The increase in oil price and reduction of international demand drastically limited Romania's capacity to obtain foreign currency. Ceaușescu, fearful of losing the political autonomy he had cultivated for years, adopted a radical strategy: liquidate the totality of external debt in the shortest possible time, even at the cost of sacrificing the population's standard of living. From 1981, practically all agricultural and industrial production was destined for export. Imports were reduced to the essential, which transformed the country into a producer for the exterior, leaving citizens without access to goods they themselves generated. A rationing system was established that regulated basic foods. In practice, quantities promised in ration cards rarely reached stores, where shelves remained empty. Urban life was organized around long queues. From dawn, thousands of people waited in front of bakeries and butcher shops with the hope of getting small rations. Families divided themselves at various points in the city to increase their possibilities, while neighbors and acquaintances established collective shifts. The black market proliferated rapidly, multiplying basic product prices and converting contraband into a vital resource for those who had contacts or additional resources. Coffee, cigarettes, and foreign clothing circulated clandestinely, while the majority of the population was forced to resort to barter as the only way to compensate for scarcity. The regime justified these privations through campaigns presented as scientific. Rational nutrition manuals recommended diets of 2,000 calories daily, when in reality many families barely reached half that amount. Propaganda described these restrictions as beneficial for health, but hospitals registered an alarming increase in malnutrition, especially among children and elderly. Limitations were not restricted to food. Energy-saving measures transformed winters into an experience of daily resistance. Blackouts were frequent and programmed, leaving entire neighborhoods in penumbra for several hours a day. Central heating was reduced to minimum, even when exterior temperatures descended below safety levels. Hot water was available in many homes only once a week, and public lighting was turned off during the night to reduce electrical consumption. Transportation also suffered severe restrictions. Fuel for private automobiles was limited to symbolic quantities, accompanied by prohibitions to circulate on certain days according to license plate. Public transport lost regularity due to lack of spare parts and fuel, forcing millions of people to move in overcrowded buses, bicycles, or on foot. State television, which had been a central instrument of propaganda, reduced its emissions to barely 2 hours daily. In that time, official newscasts and Ceaușescu's speeches occupied almost the totality of programming. Radio followed a similar pattern, eliminating most music and cultural programs. In the midst of this scarcity, demographic policy further aggravated the social situation. Decree 770, in force since 1966, prohibited abortion and restricted access to contraceptives with the declared objective of rapidly increasing the population. In practice, the measure produced thousands of unwanted pregnancies in a context of hunger and needs. Many women resorted to clandestine abortions performed in precarious conditions, which resulted in tens of thousands of preventable deaths. Hospitals were forced to perform routine controls on female workers to detect pregnancies, and local committees monitored women of fertile age as if it were an administrative matter. The increase in births exceeded the state's capacity to care for minors. Orphanages filled with children their families could not maintain. These centers functioned in critical conditions, with overcrowding, lack of personnel, and scarcity of basic resources. Thousands of minors died from untreated diseases, malnutrition, or abandonment. Those who survived were marked by permanent physical sequelae. In parallel, the Securitate intensified social control. Its informants penetrated factories, schools, and housing blocks. Surveillance reached levels where any comment could be reported. Denunciations between family members became frequent, and fear transformed private communication into an exercise of permanent caution. In work and educational spheres, citizens were forced to participate in public acts of regime support. Absence of enthusiasm could be interpreted as hostility. Children were instructed to report critical comments from their teachers and classmates, generating a culture of suspicion from childhood. Correspondence was systematically opened, telephone calls monitored, and homes equipped with listening devices. This surveillance was not limited to preventing political conspiracies, but sought to generate a state of permanent submission. The sensation of being under constant observation became an inseparable part of daily life. In 1989, Ceaușescu proudly announced that external debt had been completely paid, making Romania the only country in the socialist bloc to achieve it. However, the human cost of that decision was incalculable. Hunger, cold, maternal mortality, deaths in orphanages, and decomposition of social fabric were the price of a financial success that lacked meaning for the population. The decade closed with an exhausted society, marked by material privations and subjected to an implacable repressive apparatus. Discontent continued without expressing itself openly due to generalized fear, but the accumulation of tensions created an environment of political fragility. A localized incident was enough to unleash a chain reaction that would question the entire edifice of power built over more than 20 years. Timisoara presented a singularity that would prove decisive in the outcome of the Romanian regime. Located in the extreme west of the country, at a short distance from the borders with Yugoslavia and Hungary, the city was exposed to foreign radio and television signals that penetrated clearly into homes. While national television reduced its programming to a couple of hours daily, dominated by official propaganda, Timisoara's inhabitants could follow Yugoslav and Hungarian broadcasts with news, music, and reports that showed the accelerated transformation of the socialist bloc. That informational permeability had generated a different consciousness. Its inhabitants knew that the Berlin Wall had fallen in November, that Poland and Hungary were advancing toward multi-party systems, and that in Czechoslovakia the so-called Velvet Revolution was developing. The contrast with Romanian reality, marked by rationing, blackouts, and surveillance, became intolerable. Without intending it, the city had become a laboratory where free information clashed with the regime's repression. Timișoara's cultural diversity reinforced that singular character, with Hungarian, Serbian and German communities coexisting alongside the Romanian majority. Contact with the exterior was constant. In that context stood out the Reformed Church of the Hungarian minority, where Laszlo Tokes preached, a pastor who had become an uncomfortable voice for authorities. Born in Cluj and trained in theology, Tokes openly criticized the demolition of villages ordered by Ceaușescu within the rural systematization program and denounced restrictions on religious freedoms. His sermons circulated informally, attracting the Securitat's attention, which intensified pressure on him throughout 1989. The breaking point occurred in October when Toki appeared in a Hungarian television report directly criticizing the regime. Authorities reacted by ordering his forced transfer to a rural parish. The eviction from his residence and church intervention was set for December 15th. What in appearance was an administrative measure was transformed into a political detonator. That day, when officials arrived to execute the order, dozens of people congregated in front of the temple. They formed a human cordon to prevent entry and expressed their intention to protect their pastor. At first, the concentration had a religious character. Candles were lit, prayers were recited, and hymns were sung both in Hungarian and Romanian. However, as hours passed, the crowd grew and political slogans appeared, demands for freedom, criticism of rationing, rejection of the conducator. Defense of a religious leader was transforming into open protest against the regime. The Securitate tried to dissolve the concentration through threats and selective detentions. Each arrest, far from reducing mobilization, attracted more people. During the night, hundreds of neighbors remained in front of the church. The next day, December 16th, thousands of citizens took to downtown streets. They marched toward Communist Party headquarters, threw stones against its windows and tore down portraits of Ceaușescu, which were thrown to the ground and trampled. It was the first time in decades that a Romanian city openly expressed its opposition. Documents and official symbols were burned in public, while riot police responded with batons and tear gas. Clashes extended to multiple streets and plazas. The magnitude of protest overwhelmed local forces' capacity. The regime reacted by sending military units with armored vehicles and light tanks. Initial orders were of intimidation, but soon they opened fire against unarmed demonstrators. Hospitals received dozens of wounded, mostly young people hit by bullets. Some corpses were secretly removed and transferred to Bucharest to prevent their identification. Families were left in uncertainty, not knowing if their loved ones were dead or detained. Far from suffocating protest, violence amplified it. On December 17th, the crowd occupied key points such as the Opera, Orthodox Cathedral, and several central avenues. At that moment appeared the symbol that would become emblem of the entire revolution, the national flag with the communist coat of arms torn out, leaving a rectangular hole in the center. That visual gesture synthesized rejection of the regime and multiplied on balconies and demonstrations. The central government decreed state of emergency in Timișoara and reinforced military presence. During the night of the 17th to 18th, confrontations were registered in several neighborhoods. Tanks patrolled firing in the air, although in some cases also against crowds. Control of the city constantly oscillated between demonstrators and forces of order. Rumors about snipers and deaths in plazas increased confusion. On December 19th and 20th, mobilization reached a new dimension. Workers from main factories joined protests and paralyzed production. With working-class incorporation, protest ceased being an isolated phenomenon to become a massive movement. Tens of thousands of people occupied the city center and proclaimed Timișoara as the first city free from communism in Romania. The declaration was transmitted by local radio and disseminated clandestinely toward other regions. News that a city with military garrisons had escaped party control had immediate effect throughout the country. Timișoara's example demonstrated that organized resistance could successfully challenge the repressive apparatus. Accounts of what occurred circulated toward Bucharest and other provinces, although fragmented and exaggerated, but they coincided in a central fact. a Romanian city had broken the monopoly of power and had survived military assault. That spark lit in the country's west was about to spread toward the capital, opening the path to a national insurrection. The dawn of December 21st, 1989, brought to Bucharest a habitual winter cold, but Nicolae Ceaușescu began the day convinced that he could still control the course of events. The events of Timișoara, which had spread by word of mouth in the capital, would be neutralized with the method he had used for more than 2 decades. A massive concentration in Central Committee Plaza that, transmitted live, would show the country and the world that the regime maintained its authority intact. The Communist Party's organizational apparatus functioned with habitual precision. From dawn, buses full of workers from factories, ministries, and local committees arrived at the plaza's vicinity. Each work center had received a participation quota, with implicit warnings about consequences of not fulfilling it. Flags without the hole that had appeared in Timișoara were distributed, leader portraits and banners with support slogans. The security device was broad and showed the regime's nervousness. Cordons of militiamen, uniformed police and undercover Securitate agents surrounded the place. Snipers were posted in nearby buildings while army units remained on alert. Romanian television had prepared a carefully planned retransmission, with several cameras destined to show general shots of the crowd and close-ups of the leader on the balcony. At mid-morning, the plaza was packed. Official figures spoke of more than 100,000 attendees, a mass organized to project unanimity. The most enthusiastic sympathizers were placed in front row to guarantee that cameras captured expressions of enthusiasm. Ceaușescu appeared on the balcony along with Elena and other party members. He wore his dark coat and characteristic fur hat. The crowd, mostly forced to attend, responded with measured applause. The speech began following the accustomed script. Denunciations against supposed foreign elements responsible for disturbances, references to social peace and exaltation of National Socialism's achievements. During the first minutes, the scene maintained the appearance of routine. However, in different sectors, isolated shouts began to be heard that mixed with ovations. The murmur grew, transformed into whistles, and suddenly into sustained booing. Voices shouting freedom and down with Ceaușescu expanded like an uncontrollable echo. The dictator's expression changed in seconds. Security gave way to incredulity and soon to alarm. Cameras tried to disguise chaos with general shots, but ambient sound revealed what was happening. For the first time in more than 20 years, the propaganda machinery was failing live. Transmission was interrupted and replaced by static images, while in the plaza, bewilderment became clamor. Elena Ceaușescu. The capital thundered with freedom slogans. Security forces responded with tear gas, batons, and massive detentions, but mobilization's magnitude exceeded any control device. Around Hotel Intercontinental, foreign journalists transmitted live, converting confrontations into global news. There, shootings against demonstrators and reporters were registered, with dead and wounded among international correspondents, which further amplified international pressure. During the night of the 21st to the 22nd, Bucharest became a scene of urban warfare. Armored vehicles and tanks traveled avenues, firing bursts in the air and, occasionally, against civilians. Demonstrators responded with stones and improvised Molotov cocktails. The din of shots and sirens extended throughout the city while hospitals received an incessant flow of wounded. The morning of December 22nd arrived with a fact that radically modified the situation. Vasile Milea, defense minister, appeared dead in circumstances officially attributed to suicide. However, many interpreted it as murder after refusing to order massive repression. News spread rapidly and was understood as signal of fracture in the army. Ceaușescu immediately designated Victor Stanculescu as new minister. But he, instead of executing repression orders, ordered withdrawing troops to barracks and ceasing use of real ammunition. His decision directly disobeyed the dictator but had immediate effect. Demonstrators interpreted withdrawal as partial victory and felt backed by armed forces. The plaza in front of Central Committee filled again, now by citizen initiative. The crowd's roar reached the building's interior, where officials and guards understood that the seat of power was about to fall. Nicolae Ceaușescu walked the marble corridors seeking answers that no one was willing to give him anymore. Ministers and officers avoided his calls, while on upper floors documents were hastily destroyed. Conscious that the situation was unsustainable, Ceaușescu made a last attempt to address the crowd from the balcony, this time with a megaphone, but his words were drowned by the plaza's clamor. Outside, doors began to yield under crowd pressure. At that moment, aerial evacuation was organized. A presidential squadron helicopter landed on the building's roof to pick up the presidential couple. The sound of propellers was clearly heard in the plaza, and demonstrators looked up, immediately understanding what was happening. With shouts, they demanded preventing escape, while some tried to force access to the building. Hastily escorted, Nicolae and Elena boarded. Later, witnesses related that the dictator was pale, with face marked by tension. The helicopter took off barely seconds before first demonstrators reached upper floors. From below, tens of thousands of people saw the apparatus rise that carried away the presidential helicopter rose over burning Bucharest, carrying with it Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu, escorted by their personal doctor and a reduced group of bodyguards. From the windows, they contemplated how the capital they had molded in their image was transforming into a scene of an insurrection that escaped their control. The apparatus, a French-made Puma model, took course toward the north with destination to Snagov residence, where the dictator hoped to gather loyal forces to reorganize resistance. During the first half hour of flight, the magnitude of what had happened barely seemed to be assimilated. Nicolae observed the city trying to evaluate the extension of disturbances, while Elena clutched a bag containing documents and valuable objects. In the cabin, pilots received contradictory communications. Some control towers warned that any unidentified aircraft could be shot down. Others remained silent, reflection of a fragmented chain of command. The risk of being attacked by their own forces became tangible each minute. Upon landing in Snagov, shortly after midday, the couple found a practically empty complex. That residence, habitually full of personnel, officers and officials, was now deserted. Present guards lacked clear instructions and avoided any commitment. Telephones functioned, but Nicolae's calls to ministers and commanders received evasions or were not answered. The power structure that had sustained the regime for decades was vanishing in real time. The dictator tried to impose orders from the residence office, deploying maps and demanding reports. However, his words lacked effect. The absence of his habitual entourage, security coordinators, liaison officers, private secretaries, eloquently revealed the breakdown of his authority. The mansion, decorated with power symbols, had become an empty shell. Faced with impossibility of reorganizing defense, the couple decided to resume flight. Fragmentary news circulated about military movements north of the capital, without it being clear whether they were loyal or rebel forces. Remaining in Snagov was unsustainable. Nicolae ordered preparing the helicopter again to head toward T2, where he hoped to find a favorable garrison. The second flight was even more tense. Pilots, conscious of danger of being intercepted, alleged a serious technical failure and made emergency landing in a field near Gaiesti locality. The explanation concealed their intention to get rid of passengers whose presence made them targets. The contrast between pomp of former official displacements and image of Ceaușescu's descending in an agricultural field symbolized the collapse of their power. On foot, accompanied only by 2 agents, they headed toward a secondary road. They managed to stop an automobile driven by a doctor who, upon recognizing them, simulated a breakdown and forced them to descend. On December 22nd, garrison troops arrested them without resistance and transferred them in an armored vehicle to the city's military base. The transfer marked the end of flight. At the base, of modest dimensions compared to Bucharest installations, the Ceaușescus were housed in improvised cells. Local officers, lacking protocols for an unprecedented situation, reinforced security with perimeter patrols and checkpoints at city accesses. They feared both a rescue attempt and popular attack. During December 23rd and 24th, while the country remained convulsed by sporadic confrontations and rumors about snipers, the former leaders were subjected to fragmentary interrogations. Their responses showed absolute disconnection with reality. They remained convinced they had significant support and that their detention was product of a passing conspiracy. In Bucharest, the recently created National Salvation Front debated their destiny. Some voices asked to transfer them to the capital for public trial. Others insisted on maintaining them in Târgoviște for immediate security reasons. Uncertainty about their future coincided with accelerated deterioration of the regime in the rest of the country. Christmas Eve found Nicolae and Elena confined in a provincial base, guarded by officers who did not know with certainty what orders to fulfill. The bare walls of the garrison contrasted with palace rooms they had abandoned barely 30 hours before. The arrival of December 25th would bring with it a quick and definitive outcome that the prisoners themselves still refused to imagine. Christmas morning began cold in Târgoviște. At the military base where Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu had spent their last night as prisoners, an improvised tribunal was being prepared that would end more than 2 decades of absolute power. While in many parts of the world families celebrated calmly, in Romania a process was being organized that should symbolically close a stage and ensure that the deposed regime had no possibility of returning. During dawn, the National Salvation Front Council decided that trial would take place immediately. Urgency responded both to political necessity of marking definitive break and to security motives. In Bucharest, confrontations continued and rumors circulated about armed groups acting in the dictator's name. Keeping him alive was considered a risk the new power was not willing to assume. A room in one of the barracks buildings was enabled, a rectangular table for judges, wooden benches for accused and reduced space for armed soldiers composed the scenario. Deficient lighting and tense environment recalled more a field court-martial than formal tribunal. The organ was integrated by 5 military men, 3 judges, 1 prosecutor and 1 defense attorney designated ex officio. Colonel Ghica Popa presided over the session. Legal basis was a provisional decree issued by National Salvation Front that granted extraordinary faculties. No judicial precedent existed in Romania for a process of this nature, but urgency left no margin for broader legal considerations. A military television team was summoned to record the hearing. Intention was to have visual record that demonstrated the procedure had been carried out. Filming also reflected consciousness that that moment would have historical value beyond immediate circumstances. When accused were conducted to the room, their image contrasted with what they had projected until few days before. Nicolae wore the same dark coat used in his last speech from the balcony, although now his figure seemed shrunken. Elena, dressed austerely, preserved the bag she had maintained with her throughout flight. Prosecutor read main charges. First, genocide, pointed to accused as responsible for death of tens of thousands of people during demonstrations. Although figure was inflated, it served to give maximum gravity to process. Second charge referred to state subversion through use of armed force against people. Third accused them of destroying national economy with policies that had impoverished population. Fourth mentioned illicit enrichment and secret deposits abroad, although without documentary evidence presented at moment. Nicolae rejected tribunal's legitimacy and proclaimed himself legitimate president of Socialist Republic of Romania. He alleged he should only answer before Great National Assembly, institution already dissolved. Trial was brief. In less than 1 hour, accusation was read, responses were collected, and sentence was dictated. There was no probatory phase nor witnesses. Tribunal deliberated barely few minutes before declaring accused guilty and condemning them to death. Nicolae heard verdict pale and murmured they could have executed them without theatre. Elena shouted louder, although already with tinge of desperation. Soldiers tied their hands with improvised ropes and led them to barracks courtyard. There waited a firing squad composed of 8 paratroopers, reinforced by 5 other volunteers. Automatic rifles were loaded. Condemned were placed in front of brick wall without blindfolds. Nicolae began intoning fragments of the Internationale, while Elena continued uttering insults. Fire order was given without delay. Soldiers fired in closed burst, impacting with dozens of bullets in bodies that fell immediately. Later medical reports counted more than 100 bullet wounds. Bodies were covered with blankets and taken inside, where team officially certified death. Fragments of trial and shot bodies were transmitted that same night by national television. Images served as conclusive proof of regime's end. In streets, news was received with multitudinous celebrations. For majority of citizens, executions symbolized liberation from era marked by hunger, fear, and repression. However, summary character of process generated later criticism. Jurists and observers questioned absence of minimum guarantees and lack of concrete evidence in some charges. Discussion about legal legitimacy did not alter accomplished fact. Regime had ended definitively. Country, nevertheless, remained immersed in confrontations and confusion. Ceaușescu's execution closed a stage, but did not resolve tensions of transition that was barely beginning. Dawn after Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu's execution did not bring calm to Bucharest, December 26, when images of dead dictators had already been transmitted by national television. Capital awoke under atmosphere of collective paranoia. Instead of peace many expected, climate of hysteria fed by rumors of supposed terrorists loyal to fallen regime was installed. Radio and television, now under National Salvation Front control, disseminated continuous messages about snipers posted on rooftops, commandos hidden in tunnels, and infiltrated foreign agents. These warnings, transmitted with same imperative tone of previous propaganda, generated terror environment where each shadow seemed threat and each noise was interpreted as attack signal. For several days, capital streets remained in state of war. Isolated shots were heard in different neighborhoods, many of them product of friendly fire between units that did not recognize each other. Inexperienced soldiers, civilians armed improvisedly, and confused Securitate members opened fire at slightest suspicious movement. Result was chain of incidents where Romanians shot against Romanians amid confusion. One of most tragic episodes had occurred December 23rd, but its consequences were confirmed and disseminated in following days. At Otopeni Airport, cadets from military school traveling in convoy were confused with terrorists after television communication. Upon arriving at destination, they were received by crossfire from their own companions. Massacre left several dozen dead and more than dozen wounded, becoming symbol of how disinformation could be more lethal than organized repression. Consolidated figures in following weeks revealed more than 1,000 people died throughout country during December events, and more than 3,000 were wounded. Most disturbing was that majority of these deaths occurred after regime fall and Ceaușescu's capture, in context where violence should have ceased. While capital continued marked by sporadic shootings, National Salvation Front advanced in political and media control. From television headquarters converted into new power operations center, communiques were transmitted proclaiming revolution triumph and announcing beginning of democratic era. Execution images were disseminated in edited versions, showing enough to confirm death, but avoiding details that could awaken compassion. Front composition revealed, however, significant continuity with previous regime. Its main figure, Ion Iliescu, had been removed from leadership in last years, but his trajectory was fully communist. Many new organism members also came from Communist Party structure. For part of population, FSN guaranteed stability amid chaos. For others, it represented simple internal relief more than break with system. Legitimacy of tribunal that had judged dictators was also object of criticism in later years. National and international jurists coincided in noting absence of procedural guarantees. But in December 1989 context, popular and political pressure had made any more prolonged alternative impossible. Ceaușescu family destiny reflected same selective justice. Nicu, youngest son, was sentenced to 2 decades of prison for abuse of power and embezzlement, although he was released early in 1999-192 due to health problems. He died in 1996. Zoya and Valentin were temporarily imprisoned, but released for lack of evidence. Zoya, mathematician by training, lost her academic position and died in 2006. Valentin, nuclear physicist, managed to maintain a low profile and away from politics. The question of Nicolae and Elena's burial was initially resolved with discretion. They were buried in Ghencea Cemetery under false identities to avoid their graves becoming meeting places. Decades later, in 2010, after legal disputes promoted by their children, exhumation was authorized. DNA tests confirmed their identity, and they were reburied in a double red granite tomb near their descendants. The People's Palace, architectural symbol of the regime, posed another dilemma. Its demolition was discarded for economic and logistical reasons. Finally, it was transformed into Parliament headquarters, becoming a paradox. The greatest work of Romanian communism became the center of parliamentary democracy. Memory of dictators continued divided. The tomb in Ghencea began receiving flowers and candles, each January 26th and each December 25th. Later surveys revealed a nostalgia phenomenon. Toward mid-first decade of new millennium,